talks, then please be aware of that. And we assume that if you are audible and or visible, then you're happy with that. I think that's the formal message that I need to pass on, but the much more enjoyable message is to say welcome. A welcome to Alone Together, a third international pan-disciplinary symposium on solitude in community. It's fabulous to be together again. If only we were together. Even a few weeks ago, I thought we would be together in person, or most of us would be together in person in Poland for this event. Sadly, the events in Ukraine have prevented that, and my goodness, ours is a very small inconvenience compared to the tragedy that's happening in Ukraine for the Ukrainian people, but also for everyone surrounding them, everyone involved, including, I know, the people of Poland who are hosting this conference, notwithstanding all the wonderful, generous work they're doing to support Ukrainians fleeing from the war. So welcome. It is all the more important in difficult times, whether the pandemic a year or so ago or in times of war. Pandemic still continues, and we're now in a time of war close to many of us here at the conference. All the more important to try to understand the world better, to get together, to be in dialogue across disciplines, across professional contexts, and across the world. So welcome. You will see the three badges across the bottom of the screen. Bishop Grosseteste University, that's my university, the University of Szczecin, and the bringing those together, and many other people, the International Society for Research on Solitude. You'll see the website for that, and it's the ISRS that is the overarching body setting up this conference, the previous conferences, and much else besides. I'll talk more about that, as several of us will talk more about that as the conference goes on. My name's Julian Stern. For those of you who don't know me from Bishop Grosseteste, I'm president of the ISRS, and my co-conspirators, co-hosts in this are Gosia Wawejko and Rafa Iwański, both of the University of Szczecin. Gosia is vice president of the ISRS, in charge of all the vice, and Rafa is secretary of the ISRS, and very much not incidentally is also our technical expert for any issues that come up during this conference, technical issues that come up during this conference, and much more as well. But he's secretary of the ISRS. I'm pleased to be joined by them in this welcome. That's who we are, and we have our three photographs up there. Rafa is looking particularly moody in that photograph, but I didn't find a smiling photograph of it. Apologies, Rafa. We're indebted to many people, many organisations for enabling this symposium to take place. The whole of the organising committee, which includes the three of us, but also Paula and many other people from the University of Szczecin, particularly, who are organising this conference, and to our two host universities. To welcome us formally to the conference, I'd like to introduce the Vice-Chancellor of Bishop Grosseteste University, who is in Malta at the moment, but who joins us with a video welcome. He is the Reverend Canon Professor Peter Neal. Oh, I've got Peter Neal University. How did I get that? Sorry, Peter Neal. That would be nice if his surname was University. He'll be followed by a generous welcome from the Rector of the University of Szczecin, also on a video, Professor Waldemar Tarczyński, and Anna Murawska, head of the Institute of Pedagogy at the University of Szczecin, who will welcome us in person. So to start us off, I will welcome Peter Neal on video to welcome us to the conference. I hope this works and is audible and visible to everybody. Hello, Peter.
Dzień dobry. It's very good to be able to sponsor a conference in Solitude in such a difficult period of history, and I'm delighted that Bishop Grosseteste University is able to be part of the discussion today and co-sponsoring this. Having been through a pandemic worldwide, which is still with us, we have become familiar both with the need for human contact, but we've also got very used to the joys and pains of being on our own and solitude. I think we appreciate better how valuable it is to meet face to face, and also how valuable it is to have some time on our own and to be able to separate both. Both being alone and together are part of everyday life. And in difficult times and in good times, it is vital to be able to be in dialogue with others, exploring how the world works. And it is especially good for Bishop Grosseteste University, which is an institution which has been involved in teacher education and wider higher education for many years. And we are delighted to support this conference because it is interdisciplinary, bringing different professional contexts and also people from different international contexts to focus on something that is becoming an even bigger widespread phenomenon in solitude worldwide. Not just solitude, but also silence and loneliness. We have a long history here, influencing the world well beyond our campus, training those to train others, and educating people in the broadest possible sense. And I know that the University of Szczecin has the same interest in having a professional and practical impact. I'm so sorry I can't be with you. It's a topic that I am very interested in, but as Vice-Chancellor, I was greatly privileged to be able to say these few words of welcome. And I do look forward, through Julian, to hearing about how the conference goes and to read the proceedings. And I wish you very well for a successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, at a distance. I think we have, Rafa, do we, a welcome from the Rector of the University of Szczecin.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the Rector of the University of Szczecin, I have the honor and pleasure to open the third edition of the International Pan-Disciplinary Symposium on Solitude in Community Alone Together. This conference is organized with two universities, the Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln, United Kingdom, and the University of Szczecin. Thank you very much for this collaboration with our friends from Great Britain. The conference is held in the hybrid formula, live and online participation. The formula of the conference creates an effective interdisciplinary platform connecting global scientists from various fields and specialties. This is confirmed by our Szczecin edition of the Alone Together conference, where both the number and diversified topics and articles, tracks and special sessions cover various disciplines and scientific specialities. Additionally, I am pleased that so many of our University of Szczecin academics attend the Alone Together conference. Special words of appreciation for the Institute of Pedagogy of the University of Szczecin. I believe that they will provide significant scientific contributions and participate in further development of the Alone Together conference series. We have participants from 13 countries. I hope that the conference will provide a fruitful platform for exchanging knowledge, experience, and establishing and consolidating scientific cooperation between the conference participants. I also hope that our event will remain in your memory not only in the dimension of the exchange of scientific experiences. I warmly and cordially welcome you in friendly Szczecin to our International Pandisciplinary Symposium on Solitude in Community Alone Together. I wish you successful debates and interesting post-conference publication in prestigious journals. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very nice. And to have, I think all of us who work in the university sector, to have two heads of two universities so generously welcoming this research is very helpful, very supportive. I would like to welcome my friend and colleague Anna Murawska, who is head of the Institute for Pedagogy, within which this conference is being hosted, and who has been such a supporter of the ISRS and all of our Solitude research, both as a researcher and as head of the Institute. Thank you, Anna, and would you like to say something?
Good morning to everyone. Good morning, Julian. And thank you for these kind words referring to me. And I have a great pleasure to welcome the participants from all over the world who gathered here to exchange experience and work together on very exciting and very important to our everyday life field of solitude, loneliness, and silence. Thank you a lot for taking the time to join us today. It is the second time we have the privilege here in Institute of Pedagogy in Szczecin. We have the privilege of holding at a conference, but unfortunately, it is also the second time that we are unable to host you in person. While preparing conference, we were pleased that the pandemic situation was getting under control, so that we would be able to debate, but also have a cup of coffee together and show visitors our university and nice city. Unfortunately, it is not possible at the moment, and Julian explained the reasons for that. That seems to be very obvious, and what Julian said, it is we are upset that we do not have you here in person, but in comparison with the situation on our eastern border, it means nothing. And I hope that it will happen in future that we meet in person, as I feel among you as among good friends. It seems to be a kind of challenge for solitary researchers to conduct research, build scientific relationship, and develop cooperation while still remaining at a distance. I must admit that the challenge is being successfully undertaken. There are quite a number of initiatives that are being efficiently carried out. The main protagonists will probably tell you about them themselves, but I will just congratulate, as a lot has happened since the previous conference, since September 2020. And I would like to express my warmest thanks to everyone who made our meeting possible. Many thanks go to the entire team, Dream Team, with special thanks to Małgorzata Wałejko, Julian Stern, and Rafał Iwański, who have created a new standard for international cooperation. They have built a bridge between two universities. In addition, they have also systematically built up a community of researchers who carry out high-quality research on loneliness, solitude, and silence. I wish every participant a very productive conference with exciting and encouraging discussions and exchange of knowledge. Enjoy the conference, enjoy being alone together again. And I'm now delighted to hand over the floor to Julian again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It is good. It's important for us, I think, that we enjoy each other's work and each other's company during this event. It is important for me at every conference that I go to that the conference should be a place to confer, not to be attacking each other, to be able to disagree and agree in friendly terms. And goodness knows we need some friendship in these times, particularly. You mentioned, Anna, since our last conference and since the first conference, such a lot has happened. I will, and I don't know if the camera will pick this up, raise this book, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Solitude, Silence and Loneliness, published as part of it has the International Society for Research on Solitude logo under their heading. It's been published by Bloomsbury, major academic publisher, just a couple of months ago now, and it grew, thank you, Olivia, it grew out of these conferences and other events and seminars and so on that we were putting on. We are all immensely proud of that, and only last week we got a contract for a book series for Bloomsbury on what is called Solitude Studies. And that is a book series that will include books in many separate disciplines, and Bloomsbury are being very good in this. They will be advertising them separately to their disciplinary hosts. So we expect to get philosophy books on solitude and loneliness and silence. We expect to get, we hope to get psychology books, cultural studies books, education books, and so on. But just last week, as I say, out of this group, the group that we are today, we managed to get contracts to be able to publish a monograph series, which I hope will last for many years to come. We have also, since our last conference, published a couple of special issues of journals of Pedagogy Christiana, a Polish-based journal. We have Ruch Philosophy, another Polish philosophy journal that is publishing special work on solitude and loneliness and silence. To be able to see this conference as part of a wider network that is learning about and teaching about and working on all of these issues is wonderful. Please do speak to me or the others at the conference if you have ideas for books, for articles, for journals. It will be good to hear of any of these things. Is there anything in that I missed? I'm looking to Rafa and to Gosia to remind me if I've missed something crucial in those initial things. We have if you would like to join the society, if you're not already a member of the ISRS, good news, it is free to join. Entirely free. You can go on the website, and the website address is on the bottom of all of my PowerPoint slides, as well as some other people's, but you can search us on the web to find that out, and you can be mailed about all the events and so on, and that will have links also if you wish to publish a book, a monograph, which can also be an edited book, by the way. Although most of them will be single author. If you have an edited book, Bloomsbury are happy to receive proposals for them. Is that everything? I am trying to remember all the people and all the events. We are coming up very soon to our first plenary session, and I'm looking to Dat, who is doing that. to see if he is ready, because I appreciate that sometimes people are preparing I am someone who prepares right up to the last minute. So to start 5 minutes early would be a tragedy for me, because I would have 5 minutes less preparation. But I think he looks very ready. Yes, he is very ready to me. So welcome everybody. We have 28, we have more people, we have 28 at least people from 13 countries all around the world. Looking forward to hearing Dat, what you have to say. Dat Bao is one of the series editors for the Bloomsbury Solitude Studies monograph series that I was just talking about. He is based at Monash University in Australia. He is an expert in language teaching and will talk, I hope, will introduce his own newly launched journal well, I hope he will launch that better than I will, and is talking about the multiple meanings of silence in contexts. Implications for learning and communication. It has been a pleasure in recent months getting to know Dat and to be able to work with him within the society, within the monograph series, and now within the conference. So if other people, whilst Dat is talking, if you could mute yourselves, that will be helpful. I will stay unmuted just in case there's anything to manage. If you have questions, there will be a period for questions towards the end after Dat has spoken, but you may wish to put those questions in the, if you're able to, in the comments. Are we able to comment? I'm just trying to see if we've got comments switched on. Are we able to comment? I can't see a comment switch, so maybe we're not, but we'll be able to manage that after you talk. But Dat Bao from Monash University, Australia, welcome, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Julian. First of all, my apology for the fact that my name doesn't show on my screen. I've tried, but again, my name is Dat Bao, call me Dat. I'm from Monash University. A warm greetings from Australia. Light to the window where you are, and I love to say good morning, but sometimes it's not necessary because I understand the morning over there is already very good. I wish I have had a chance to be part of the previous conferences, but I happen to know about RSIS very recently, less than a year ago, when I approached Julian to invite him to join my journal, which is the Journal of Silent Studies in Education that was established late last year, to be on board. And then he kindly invited me to join the RSIS, and it was such a great pleasure to be a member. And ever since we've started working together on this book series project that Julian just mentioned, that was beautiful. And I would like to say thank you for the honor to give the first paper today, sharing my research experience as relating to the topic silence in the setting of education. Let me start by trying to share screen, but I'm not sure I can share. The function happens to kind of fail from where I am. I like to share screen for me based on what I sent to him before.
One moment. That I open your presentation. One moment, okay?
Yes, Rafael. Thank you. Thank you very much. You can see this. I'm here to share ideas related to my research, multiple research projects, which I call them together as the multiple meaning of silence in context. Before this, I've been reading the book that Julian just mentioned, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Solitude, Silence and Loneliness, because I offer to write a book review, a review of this book to be published in the Journal of Silent Studies in this coming June. And I will, before publishing, I will send it to Julian for a brief look, and then as I promised Bloomsbury, I will send it to Bloomsbury too, just before, to make sure everything is good before I publish the review. One thing that I learned from reading this book is the idea of how each of these themes, solitude, silence, and loneliness, speak for themselves in context. It's very hard to understand any of these themes without context. And my talk today will echo some of those ideas, some of those understand. It is through context that meaning is created. And the focus is silent. But I'd like to begin by sharing with you a bit of a story about how I started off embarking on the topic of silence. Let's please, yeah. Yeah, Raphael, can you help me move on to the next? Thank you. So it started when I was a child. I still remember when I was a primary school kid, I was very, very talkative, very hyperactive. I always talk, always move, always run around. And I even believed that I could fly. You will see in the next slide. This is an imagined picture of me flying. Yes, next, Rafa. Yes, thank you. So I was very noisy. And when I was in primary school, my teachers were very disturbed by my behavior. So one day, one of my primary school teachers rang up my mother, and she said, "Look, you got to do something about your son, because no one in the class can study with him in the class. He always disturbs people. He always tries to talk, interrupting." My mother was very worried, and she was in tears. She had this conversation with my father, and they decided to condition me, to kind of discipline me, so that I become less talkative. You can imagine where they send me to, not a mental hospital, not rehabilitation center, but it is a temple. She'll show you the next picture of a temple. Yeah. And so I work with these kids throughout over a year, sitting through, maybe back one step. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, rough. Sorry about that. So I practiced Zen meditation in the temple, and many kids had to give up because it was such a tedious task, practicing meditation, trying not to move, trying not to speak. And many kids had to leave school, but I stayed. And it took me about a year and a half to become well-behaved, in the sense that, you know, I became very quiet when I go to school. My teachers were very happy. And maybe next, Raphael. Yeah. So this is what I looked like when I was about 12 years old. I was less naughty, but I think I wasn't happy. You know, I was trained to betray my psyche. I was angry inside. I was rebellious. I was noisy. I was everything except silent. But on the outside, I was not talking. So I managed to graduate from high school and move to university. It is in university that I was asked to speak. I was enrolled in a bachelor program of English literature, and that was a course where you had to participate, you had to express yourself a lot, but I didn't. I was very, very quiet throughout. Imagine how hard it was for me to make that change, but that change at that point stayed in me. And my teachers were not happy, university teachers. One day, one of my literature teachers pointed at me and said, Now you need to open that mouth and speak. Next picture, yep. Open. You need to open that mouth and speak because this is an English class. Otherwise, you will never graduate. So I struggle again from someone that had been made to be quiet. I started a journey going back to be talkative again, trying to speak. And it was equally hard compared to the time I tried to become silent. But I managed and I survived. So I graduated next with a bachelor degree in English literature. So that was an image of a school, a university in Thailand, actually, where I graduated. And I moved on becoming a teacher at an institute called the English Language Education Institute in Assumption University in Bangkok, Thailand. And next is the picture of the classroom where I taught. Yep, let's move to the next slide. One thing you might notice is students in this class seem to be very, very quiet. They don't talk, they are not active, they didn't participate. No matter how hard I try to get students to discuss, they are very, very passive. And I felt very difficult. It was hard to teach. And I realized that up to that point in my life had not been easy. You know, from a talkative child, I started to be quiet, and the training was very tough. And then from a quiet child, I started going back the journey of being talkative again, and it was equally tough. But it is here in this classroom, my first job, that I was confronted by silence again. And by then I began to think of this. Wasn't it easier for the system to let students behave in the way they like, meaning let those quiet learners to be quiet and let talkative learners to be talkative? Why did people have to bend students' ways to suit the mechanics of the system? So I thought a lot about not just the question of silence, but also the question of speech. Then I went into the discourse, academic discourse, and tried to read about issues. But one thing I noticed at the time I was a student in the UK, there was not many books on silence back then, but there were a whole lot of materials on speech. So when it comes to learning in schools and universities, it is speech that is the key to success, not silence. And so everything I read was about the value of verbal interaction. And I thought I would love to learn and understand more about silence, but I didn't have the tool to research. I had no idea what to do, how to go about research. But I developed this passion. Next, please. Yeah, thank you. So I thought about this. Passion is very important. My parents used to say, don't follow a career that you have no passion for. So I was very passionate about this topic. And then it was not until I got enrolled in this is what was called Leeds Beckett University, which is in Leeds City in the northern part of the UK. It was a 6 years PhD degree program. I got enrolled, and next is the picture of the campus where I study. Yeah. Next, please. Yeah. So this is Leeds Beckett campus. And I was in a department called Childhood and Education. I was studying educational psychology and linguistics. At the same time, I started my PhD thesis here, supervised by a psychologist and a linguist. I decided to embark on a project related to silence. So I went back to the city I was born, which was called Sagan, and I went to a school, an English Language Institute in a university called National University English Language Institute to observe, and hopefully I find people who maybe are prone to silence, either suffering from silence or enjoy the silent mode of learning. I want to study them to see what happened to them. Is silence helpful in their learning, or is it damaging to their learning system? And so next, please, is a picture of the language school. I observed 15 different classrooms, and in every classroom, I single out a few very quiet individuals to interview them for 3 semesters to see how they evolve in the way they think. And to make a long story short, I would like to present one of the key findings, which is from my PhD thesis. So next slide is the finding I like to share with you. I learned that silence comes from a very complex process of perception and behavior of not just one person. I was interviewing 15 teachers and conducted a survey on 200 students, following students through their classes in order to observe their behavior. And I was able to put together the perceptions of students and teacher to see how these perceptions interact with each other, how they match. And I realized this, which I draw into this map. Students are very shy. They wanted to speak, but they was not encouraged enough to speak, and therefore they remained very quiet. The teachers, fortunately, didn't know that. So many teachers assume students do not wish to speak, and therefore they decided to keep a lecturing mode. The students being observed, being exposed to lecture, they decided that perhaps the teacher didn't want to encourage them to speak, so they withdrew into themselves and they stayed very quiet. They gave up the desire. The teacher decided that, well, my student's not going to talk. What's the point of trying to get them, wait for them? So I will just lecture. Yeah. So silence comes from that dynamics of teacher and learner behavior in the classroom by way of serious misunderstanding. Now, I finished my PhD thesis with this idea, which is the main finding. I wasn't very happy. There was nothing here related to my question, although I found this valuable dynamics of what brings silence into the classroom. I realized that it's not related to my story. There must be a community or individuals out there who suffer the same scenario as me growing up, you know, having to kind of betray their style in order to please the system. And so I decided to continue my project. I got my degree out of this dissertation, but I decided to continue. I replicated this project in a high school in the same city. Next, please. And so this is a picture of a high school in the same city where I decided to observe and interview students about their silence. And here are some of the findings. Next, please. Yes. Students allowed me to see these things. Silence comes from poor conditions for speech, namely uninspiring lesson content. They don't feel they want to participate because the lesson was not interesting enough for them. They also realized they didn't talk much because lessons never seemed to have enough time for them. The teacher was so worried about fulfilling the syllabus and the curriculum, and besides, the examination system requires students to write most of the time, and there's no speaking components in the exam system. Also, some students voiced their concern that the level of challenge in every lesson is sometimes not appropriate for them to speak, sometimes too easy and they don't feel excited, and sometimes too difficult, they don't have the ability to participate. Other factors include the way teachers are in exercising power, creating an authority gap between teachers and students, And most of all, the long tradition of quiet behavior in the classroom that eventually caused students to be very quiet. In this project, I realized that findings became a little bit more diverse, and I became even more interested in the topic of silence, because I noticed for the same design, when I replicate the research design in two different contexts, they gave me two different sets of findings. And I thought, if I would start again in a different context. And the day came when I could do that in Australia. Next slide, please. Thank you. 2007, I was hired by Monash University. That was 15 years ago. And this is a picture of a building where I used to teach in the arts faculty of the university. I noticed that in every class I was teaching third year teacher education courses, third year students, and most of my students are white Anglo-Australians. I noticed in every class there would always be a few students who are very quiet. And I started to think silence is not something imported from Asia into the West, but here in one of those Western countries that I know very well, there will always be individuals who don't want to talk very much. So next slide, please. This is a picture of next is a picture of one of my classes. And I identify in every class 1 or 2 students who were very quiet. Eventually, I found 10 Australian students who were very silent. I interviewed them and do jump to the findings. Here are the key findings from this project. Next, please. According to Australian students' views, someone who is talkative in their mother tongue can be very silent in a different language. Language matters. They also reveal the fact that silence is governed or influenced by a wide range of factors, including classroom culture, peer relationship, individual personality, student mood on a day-by-day basis, the content of the lesson, teacher receptivity, student inspiration, and the level of challenge. So part of these findings, one of these findings echo some of the things I found before, but they together expand the understanding of what silence means to me at that time. And again, I would say every time I replicated the same project design in new context, I have something new to enjoy. And no time anymore. So the next project was in Japan. Next slide, please. I was reading into Confucius teaching as relating to silence, because some of the academic work related to silent students in the West seem to indicate the fact that many students from East Asian backgrounds imported silence into the learning scenario because of Confucius teaching in the old time, whereby silence was valued, and these students brought these values to Western educational context. But I realized that when I read again some of Confucius' work, Confucius praised verbal communication as well. He said, in your study, if you don't understand, please ask. We must ask to learn. So he equalized learning with asking. So verbal communication is also praised in Confucius' teaching. Then I decided to study students from East Asian background, where they are heavily influenced by Confucianism. So the next slide will show you an image of a classroom in Japan, where I conducted a survey on 120 students about their silence. I also single out 10 very quiet students, to interview them about what silence means to them, to their learning. Are they happy with their silence? Are they unhappy? And so here are some of the key findings from this project. Next, please. Japanese students say every individual has a dual responsibility towards the learning of themselves and towards the learning of others. When they are silent, they are also helping other people, giving them space either to think or to speak. So their silence is not useless, but they are aware that their silence has a bonding implication, has some meaning to it. For some reason, the slide doesn't show words. Let's try again. Yep. So that's what they say. Every individual has a dual responsibility for the learning of themselves and the learning of their community. And then they also say, next please. They also say, between talk and silence, it is talk that hurts, not silence. So when they are not sure whether they should speak or they should keep quiet, then they will go for silence first to be safe. Many are aware that listening is also participation. Listening is to make a connection, and silence is not emptiness, but it allows an internal dialogue to happen within themselves. So that was the finding of the project in Japan. Then I decided to repeat this study in a different context. So I moved to China. Next slide, you will see a city in China, which is Wuhan. Wuhan is a city with the second largest number of universities in China. And here I conducted another survey and interviewed again 10 students about their silent learnings. I heard from students an interesting story that I'd like to share with you now. So we move to the next slide. So here it goes. Once upon a time, there's a flea trapped in the bottle. Every day the flea tries to get out of the bottle, but it just couldn't, simply because there was a cap on top. Next slide. Yep. And then one day the cap was removed, but the flea continued to stay in the bottle. It didn't try to jump out anymore. It is because now the cap is in the flea's mind. Next, please. So these are the findings from the project in China. I learned from data that there exists a gap between what is expected in high school and what is expected in university. Students said in high school, they were disciplined to be obedient, to stay quiet and accept what is taught. However, when they proceeded to university levels, they were encouraged to think more for themselves, to ask questions, participate. You see there's a gap between what was expected when they were younger and what were expected when they were older. Going back to the same story. Next, please. Yeah. So the flea is the student and the bottle represents silence. The cap represents expectation toward silent obedience. Yes, next, please. Even when the cap is removed, I think something is missing there. I think some slides I think will just happen to be gone, but let me explain. And when the cap, the expectation towards silent obedience is removed, when students were expected to speak, they stop speaking. They don't try anymore, because now the reluctance had already been built in their heart. So that was the key finding from the Chinese project. Next project was replicated in the context of career, and I did the same thing. So these are the findings from the Korean projects. I will show you in the next slide. Students said to me, silence can be a form of resistance. Silence is not obedient at all. They were silent because they resist, they disagree with the teacher, perhaps pedagogy, perhaps something else. Silence also allows students to monitor words inside them quietly to avoid rushing toward what they call premature performance. Silence allows students to incubate abilities for future communication. So there's a connection between what students do in silence and the quality of their speech as a result of such a mental processing exercise. So that was the finding. And back at Monash University, I decided to study the same students that I studied before in Vietnam. Now that they are in Australia, many of them, I thought for those people who got the exposure to Western education, perhaps they started to use silence in different ways. I wanted to see how they've changed. And so this is a picture of students at Monash University, but mainly students from Vietnam. And I conducted the same project with them. And here are some of the key findings from the study. Next, please. So from Vietnamese students' perspective, silence is autonomy. This is something that I didn't find from the previous studies. And it's a conscious choice. Silence is not passive. Silence is some kind of a decision. Why? Because it helps students enhance the quality of talk. I also learned from the data that between silence and talk, there are other constructs that are not clearly talk, but not clearly silence either. There are three different kinds of in-between of silence and speech. One is called inner speech, or sometimes known as inner talk, quiet talk in the mind. Two is private talk, which is whispering to yourself. And three is whispering to the next person. So there are inner speech, private speech, and insider speech. The discovery of these constructs are not new because it was already found in the old literature from 19th century discourse in psychological research. But it is here that interestingly students kind of identify them by themselves, and the construct, the five constructs on the continuum from silent to inner speech, private speech, insider speech, and speech show that the contrast between silence and speech is not clear anymore. It becomes very shady, which allowed me to come to a conclusion that talk and silence are more similar than we would have thought. And they are similar in the sense that they can both be very negative and they can both be very positive. They can be productive and destructive, respectively. Here are some examples, some explanation. If reasonable talk keeps conversation progressing two ways, reasonable silence allows students to leave space for each other. Likewise, talk is only valuable when it makes sense to the listener, and silence is only valuable when it is wisely employed for active processing in the mind. Next will be a few more points in concluding this talk. I learned that silence is not independent from talk. It is part of talk rather than the opposite to talk. It is closely connected to talk as much as talk is connected to silence. Some of the functions that we exercise when we use verbal speech, when we speak, and when we resort to silence are actually the same. And some of them can be mediating, preparing, responding, comparing, analyzing, all of those things in silent will support talk. I think I will just have that one was the last slide. Thank you very much for your engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dat. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Yes. So if I could find where's the, oh, there it is. Yes. You will, I'm sure, have clapping from many people when they can find the clap button on there. That's wonderful.
Okay.
You are a one-person international research project. In your work and your research, you have, as it were, covered, I know not the whole world, but I know you have worked in so many countries and researched, and fascinating to hear what those distinctions are. You described the findings in different countries as quite different. Were these the additional findings? Can I start? Sorry, chair's privilege here. Can I ask a question? And I'll ask other people if they have questions, of course. Did you find these are cumulative? In other words, did you find common things in all the different contexts? But what you have presented to us are some of the extra things you found in each country? Or was the whole approach to silence and understanding silence different as a whole in each of those contexts? Can I ask?
Sure. Yes, please.
Did you hear my question, Dat?
Yes, I could hear your question. Yes, very clear. Thank you, Julian. Yes. Was it directed to, yes, to the audience, to everyone? Yes.
Or to you? No, I was asking you, but other people, yes, I'm sure, will have other ideas as well.
Yes, the connection.
Torgia has his hand up as well, perhaps through a question. But would you like to start? And Torgia, would you like to join in? Do you have a possible answer or an additional question?
I think I missed part of your question, but I think it was about the connection, yeah, among the
in the different countries that you studied.
Yes.
Where all their response is different, or were you just telling us some of the different things you learned, but they had similarities too?
Yes, definitely. The first similarity, Julian, is the fact that silence is very deeply contextualized. Silence is a kind of constant response to the environment wherever you are. When you move to a different context and you find yourself modifying your behavior and understanding. So there were Japanese students, for example, that I used to know in Japan. And when they moved to Australia, they started to pick up some of the Australian ways of behaving. For example, back home, they were very quiet. But it was here in Australia that they had the pressure from classmates to open up a little bit more. Likewise, there are Western students in countries like the US, Australia, for example, and even the UK. Some of these students that I know, a few of them, they went to Asian studies program and they study some of the culture topic subjects and languages like Korean language, the Japanese language, and so on. They suddenly became very quiet, not just because the language itself is difficult, but also they pick up the cultural element, the cultural behavior of the surrounding of peers, and they begin to kind of adapt. So the common thread that joins students' behavior across the world, I noticed, is the adaptivity that students give themselves as they merge into a new context, and the different, as you already can predict, who come from their background mostly. as much as from their own individual personalities.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. Torgeir, you did have a question, I think.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Because your presentation was absolutely outstanding and very illuminating, but sometimes there's like this blip on the, like latency on the internet connection.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so it's really fascinating the way you set this up with your own biography, yeah, and the way you come into this topic, and you relate your personal background. And as someone who has teacher's education enforced upon us, you have a long university education, you have a PhD, right? And then you have to do, pedagogy in order to be certified as a teacher. And, one thing that is a bit frustrating about that, and, it's very recognizable from your own narrative, in your own, you start to teach and you have all this, children or students there who don't want to speak, yeah? And you've been taught in pedagogy seminar that they are supposed to speak and they don't speak. It's not like by the book. It doesn't, like in the book it says they're supposed to speak and then they don't. So what do you do? And and then at the end of your presentation you have this much more complex view on silence, where you realize that silence can actually be a form of resistance to you. And then you really are in a dilemma. So the question is, how do you relate to I'm sure you are still teaching, future teachers today. What do you tell them about silence as a strategy that they will meet when they go out into the classroom? What have you learned about that? Yeah, in a very practical level.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Very good question. Over the years, recently, I've started a few more projects, and one of the things I recently learned is that in every classroom, silence occurs not in one way, but it occurs in different ways. Some students suffer from silence because they are too shy, because they feel intimidated, because they feel incompetent. Others are silent, but they are advanced. So when the teacher asks a question that is not their level yet, they will wait for a more difficult question to speak. So their silence actually resonates confidence rather than suffering. So I often encounter both kinds of students in the same class. And so I decided that, and I tested this out a few times and get students to reflect on. I started to encourage, but if I do this, I have to do it in different ways, because the moment I encourage the shy student to speak, I will use a different kind of language, such as, come on, don't be shy. And it will hurt the ego of the students who are silent with confidence. So I can't do that with them, with these students. I have to question until nobody can answer and they will be the last to raise their hands. So one of the things I do two different things which I think work by way of students' feedback. One is I diversify activities so that there will be, for example, involving and engaging activities. Involving means easy tasks so that everyone can participate. They participate physically by way of moving, by way of saying easy things. But I also direct engaging activity, which are mentally, cognitively challenging tasks for those students who expect higher in the way content of the lesson gets to them. And so I diversify task type. And then if I conduct a task which is easy to respond to, the next task I will make it difficult so that this will tap into the ability of more advanced students. Another thing I do is I observe student silence to see if there's an outcome. For example, I direct a task and I walk around and see what students do. Normally, those who are silent, thoughtfully, they will focus. For example, they will look at a text, they will jot down some ideas, they will underline text, they will turn around and try to share a thought. They will do something. But with students supposed to be passive or lazy, they will just lay back and they will check phone or they will look out the window. I can always observe and tell them. So what I ask for eventually, which I also say at the beginning of the activity, is that I give you 10 minutes of silence for you to work, but in the end, I expect the outcome from you, either in speaking or in writing. The want to share ideas with me verbally. I like you to give me some notes that you jot down, and eventually I work around and I ask each team, each table, to actually have a representative voice to tell me what they collected from their group. And that normally students kind of like this space where they have the liberty to exercise what they love to do first. And then in the end, they felt that I was responsible enough as a teacher to care and to follow up on what they've learned rather than just to blow them off and say, you do whatever you like. They like the responsible teacher who actually pay attention and eventually come to them and say, so what have you got for me? You know, so those are basic things that I've done in the classroom. I hope I answer a bit of your question, Alex. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And of course, we have 35, 40 people who are being silent as well. In all those ways, I'm sure that you describe. Alex Ciarciński, you have a question. Hi, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello. You mentioned about South Korea, about silence as a resistance. I think that Torgeir asked a little bit about it, and somehow Julian asked about common things. Is it your observation or intuition or research? Is it common aspect of silence, this resistance? I mean, for example, Europe, because I now you realize me that in Poland, each time when we are working, when I'm working with students and I experience silence from students' side, it could mean resistance. Is it common in other countries, not only in Korea?
There's a book in Japan, and what I know from reading education book in Korea and Japan, in high school, students can be very stubborn when they don't enjoy their learning. So silent for many of them at puberty. It's a lot of resistance. But I noticed when it comes to university, the resistance become less severe, and it will vary on a case-by-case basis. You can always tell, maybe not so much always, but you can sometimes observe and realize there's an occasional student who actually resists your teaching style. There will always be, no matter how good we are, there will be students who are resistant to a certain style of the way we manage classroom activities. And I think that is very hard to observe just by looking. There will be a point where we might walk around and we might check with students to see if they have anything to say, to see if they produce any work. And most importantly, when it comes to their essay writing, you can hear that in the essay. If they resist any ideas in the classroom, they will argue. They will say, but this is what I think, and then you can spot some of those things out. But having said that, there's nothing absolute about resistance. A student who resists today may be very different tomorrow when the method or the content of the lesson change. So in response to your question, Alex, is it common? I would say it's not very common in Australia where I teach, but when I move to another context and observe, such as in Japan in particular, there's a lot of resistance in high school, but not in university. So again, that wouldn't be too common. It has to be very occasional, and we learn about those things based on first observation, and second talking with students, and third through the work that they produce. Thank you. For asking.
Henrietta, would you like to?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Congratulations on your speech. and I thought I was fascinated by the idea to give people, the students, the option of giving their answers in writing too. I think that's a wonderful idea, and I'll keep it in mind. That's very useful. Speaking of that, I also like to write and talk too. And this is just a moment, sorry for Rafal. It seems that I cannot use the chat, but that's for...
No, I'm sorry, the chat is not connecting to the West.
Okay, that's fine. My question was for you, in the interviews, do students ever reflect upon their silence strategy? I mean, do they ever express regret? I wish I was more talkative, or I wish I spoke my mind more. I wish I changed or nuanced my strategy.
Yes, thank you for the question, Henrietta. I think from what I observed, and also some of the data pointed to the direction where it was not so much a regret, but it was a bit of a disagreement with the teacher. They didn't regret their personality for not talking, but they regret the fact that the teacher didn't make the extra effort to help them speak when they need to speak. But they was at some point very shy. And so I asked them about the behavior, the intention. I said, do you behave in the way you intended? They said, no. Some of them said, I wanted to speak so much and I waited for my teacher to either make eye contact with me, to either give me time or come up and encourage me, even nominate me to speak. But the teacher was too busy. Once he asked the question and some of the strongest students have addressed the question with a good answer, the teacher decided to move on, and we who are weaker students in the class somehow lost the opportunity to respond to some of the question, and up to some point they felt sad for having been left out of the conversation without the teacher knowing. And so the kind of regret that they have is they wish that the teacher had seen that in them and walk up and actually help them rather than kind of ignore them. So there was a bit of that. I think your guess is right. Yeah, there was a bit of that too, Henrietta.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Of course, we should leave silence for people to think about what you're saying as well. But if people have questions, please, if you put your hand up as well. Can I ask, there seems to be a similarity, some of the work I've done on performance, musical performance or comedy performance, that the audience may be relatively quiet, but it is not a silent silence, that you actually are sensitive to. A performer will be sensitive to the audience and will even make some noise, even with shuffling, snuffling, some very low noises. And the American composer John Cage wrote a famous piece, which is described as his silent piece, but it's not, called 4 minutes 33 seconds, where you sit at a piano and don't push any notes down. And it's because he was interested in what the audience noises were whilst he was sitting at the piano, not pressing the keys down. And he actually describes performing his piece, his famous piece, in the middle of a forest, listening instead to the deer or the rabbits or the rustling of the leaves. And so for him, the apparent silence of the audience is not silent at all, and was itself observable and of interest, just as the silence of the countryside has a noise and can be observed, even if it's quiet. Is that similar to what you are saying, the in-between the absence of all noise and speech? There are many varieties of noises that are significant.
Yes, it is, Julian. I think what you've just shared is amazing. I think it taps into some of the things that students share with me too. They think there should be a moment of quietness for them to think. And some said sometimes there's a tricky issue that I need to spend more time reflecting upon, but I hear noise around me and I hear too many verbal activities being conducted by the teacher, and those moments interfere with my thinking. So they said those moments of quietness are often filled in by teachers who are less experienced. They say more experienced teacher will respect silence when they know that there is something for them to think about. And so it's very much similar to the music performance you just mentioned, where it is intended for a response and for a reaction, rather than just plain pure meaningless emptiness.
Thank you. Yes, you can watch videos of the performance on the piano of the piece, yeah. But also there is a heavy metal band that performs the same piece, and it is of course completely different, although they also don't play any notes because they're a heavy metal band.
Yeah.
And it's the context, as you say, is important.
Yes. Thank you, Julian.
I will. Are there other questions or comments? I think you have left us also thinking. I know I am filling in the silence, and apologies, but you've left us thinking so much about so many issues, both personal and pedagogical. Have you written about the silence of teachers, by the way?
Yeah, yeah, that's a very that's a very good question. I'm actually writing a book, and the book is called Silence in Pedagogy. It will be published early next year with CUP. And in that book, I was arguing, as drawing from research, that teachers should practice silence in their teaching. If they want students to use silence meaningfully, there should be instruction, there should be guidance, and also there should be the act of silence on the part of the teacher in order for students to behave accordingly. Otherwise, if the teacher asks students to be silent productively and the teacher themselves keep talking, that will be meaningless. So what you had actually was what I've been writing about for the past a year and a half, which I hope when the book completes, I will recommend it to ISRS as well as to our community here. Yep.
Thank you. I still remember, and I think, well, Ava was there with us, Helen Lees, who is coming to this conference,
yes,
who presented on silence at a philosophy of education conference and started her presentation with silence. And the chair kept saying, "You can start." And she didn't want to say out loud, "I have started," because that would stop the silence that she was demonstrating. Yes. And eventually the chair realized that she had started as she stared at the chair to stop them breaking the silence. It's quite hard for a teacher to break their speech with silence.
Exactly. And that reminds me of a joke that one of my friends made. He asked me, what is the most fragile thing in the world that even mentioning it will break it? And he answered for me. He said, silence.
Are there any other questions right now? Are there any questions you would like to ask us, by the way, Dat? That's Kai.
Yes. Yes.
You have a question. I will still ask you again, Dat, in a minute. But Kai, what would you like to ask us?
Yes.
Yes, Dad. I have a question because I'm not doing a research which is on silence as well, but I'm now seeing silence from the verbal learner's perspectives. So I have only one very quick question. That is, when your teacher said your mom that your talk disturbed the students in the class, they are learning, they disturbed other students learning. So at that time, in your opinion, do you think that other students' silence also disturb your learning? So for example, you were very active and you wanted to talk. So at the same time, so for your learning, you might need talk. You might need others' opinions. But at the time, other students were silent. They did silent learning. So did you feel like their silence didn't help your learning?
I asked a similar question to my participant, but it seems that nobody mentioned silence as disruptive. Many students who need to use silence did mention talk as being disruptive, but no verbalized, highly verbal student mentioned silent student affects me except when they are pair or group with people who are silent, and they said, well, it was annoying to realize that people in your group don't contribute. That's what they said. But when I talk to silent students in group work, how do you feel about your silence in a group? And they all said to me, we try to speak. We are silent learners when we need to process highly cognitive level of information. But then when it comes to group work, we are aware of responsibility. So we speak, but somehow the volume of our speech is not sufficient to please the verbal students. And so they want more. But the tension tends to happen more between silent thinker and those who are talkative, rather than, the other way around.
Yeah. So for example, and another thing is, for example, in the group work, so one silent student, they did silent learning, and the time is very limited in group work as well, right? Yeah. So when you didn't get the contribution from silent learners in group work, so do you think that it disturbed your learning, and do you feel that you can learn a lot?
I can easily spot them out when we have group works in the class. There are different groups, and there are groups who are more talkative than other group. I will walk up to the silent group and observe them a little bit to see if they need any help. But most of the time, they don't obviously need help. They are thinking. And so I noticed that, some of them are taking notes. So what I could do is I attend to those notes. I say, are you writing your ideas? Can I read them out for you later? And some of them say, no, we will read them for you. Yeah, normally. So sometimes we underestimate students. We say, you're silent, you're not learning, you're not participating, you're not helping other learners. But some of those silence, they actually produce a lot of high quality discussion. But I realize I need to give them time and space, and I need to follow up. If I have a method of following up on student special learning, I will get what I want. But if I assume that, oh, you are silent, you're behind, then I'm actually the one who is behind myself.
Thank you so much, Dad.
You're welcome.
Can I?
Yes.
Yes.
Before more questions, I'd like to ask everyone, just first saying thank you for your engagement, and also like Julian mentioned earlier, we had a journal, and I'd like to kind of openly invite you to contribute to this journal. We call it again the Journal of Silent Studies in Education, and we started with just one first issue last year, and this year we're gonna have two more issues, and we would like to invite your contribution. I realize we don't have to all be expert in silent studies, but we can always write about silence ethnographically, or our case or observation. Silence is always new, solitude and loneliness. When I read the handbook, I realized that there's a lot more that the author wanted to say, but there are not enough spaces for them to say. And that's why Julian and our team, including myself, we started this beautiful series Into the Future with Bloomsbury, whereby we invite contribution into more research into solitude, silence, and loneliness. And likewise, the journal is very hungry for your work. We listed up. Julian is on the editorial board, and Eva here is also with me on the editorial board, and about 15 of us, and many of us are members of IRSIS. We build the list of themes there are 80 themes. If you go to the focus, the scope of the journal, you click that and you will see there are 80 different themes. Some of them include solitude and loneliness, of course. And then you realize that there are a lot of areas along those themes that researchers have not exploited enough. So there will be a lot more to write from a amic perspective, personal perspective, from a collective perspective, and across the discipline. So there's a whole lot to discover and to write about. We encourage you to, if you find the time, please write for us. Our research areas, including solitude, silence, and loneliness, still very relatively a new area compared to many other aspects of research across the discipline. And we really need to be together and build these areas as it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. On behalf of everyone here, you've given us so much to think about, so much to do. I'm always puzzled by the page near the back of a booklet that says this page is left blank, and you think, no, it's not. It says this page is left blank, and the same with silence. It is easily broken. And to be treasured. But thank you for what you've said and what you've left for us to think about. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My bells are ringing for 10:30. We go on to the next session now. Because of the conference, partly, well, it is online, and we're able to move without parallel sessions, so we have just a single track through the conference. So I'm moving on and handing on my chairing duties, the moderating duties, to Kate Ciarcińska from the University of Szczecin. Are you there, Kate? I'm
yes,
sorry. Good. There you are. Hi. Good to see you. And I think, are you happy to introduce the next session, Theories of Solitude? These are loose groupings of papers, as it's 10:30 in Poland. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much. Let me say that I'm very delighted to introduce and moderate the session Theories of Solitude, and let me introduce the speakers that are going to take part in this very session. The first person who is going to speak is Piotr Domeracki from Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń, with the topic, The Idea of Solitude in Existential Philosophy, an overview of the issue. The second speaker is Olivia Sagan from Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh, from the UK, with the topic, the problem of loneliness. The third speaker is Henrietta Anisoara-Serban from Institute of Philosophy and Psychology, Constantin Radulescu-Motru, and Institute of Political Sciences and International Relations, Ion Bratianu of the Romanian Academy, with the topic, Solitude as Subjective Horizon. The fourth speaker is Torgeir Fjeld from Reinis Center for Philosophy and the Arts from Norway and Poland, with the topic, A Silent Trace, introducing Wolfgang Schirmacher's Philosophy of the Future. And last but not least, Professor Jaromir Brejdek from the University of Szczecin, Poland, with the topic, The Social Ontology, or the Ontology of a Lonely Individual, the Crucial Role of Empathy, a Philosophical Approach. So we are going to have a very interesting session. I'm very excited to hear all the presentations. And let us start with Piotr Domeracki.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Katarzyna. I would like, if I may, to make a presentation. Is it possible at all just now? How do you think?
Let's try it.
Could I play my presentation for myself? Okay, I'll try to do it.
Proszę udostępnić, otworzyć prezentację na komputerze i udostępnić. O, jest, widzimy.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I would like to point out the outset that my presentation has just an introductory character, preparatory rather. I'm only signaling what I think are some of the key issues. They all, of course, require further study and further deepening. However, I only have a quarter.
Excuse me, just for a second, but I'm afraid that we can't see your presentation. Could you please share your screen again? Because we can't see it.
Okay.
Take your time. We have time, so.
Małgosia, maybe I can make it available as a file to all of participants. How do you think? And then another person could.
But means you mean I can't get it. You mean sending it, emailing it to us, and then we could share it.
Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah.
Yes. Okay. So please email it to us, to Rafał or to ESRS. Okay, and we will share it and operate it.
So sorry for the interruption.
Never mind. It's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
It happens. It happens.
But at the Teams platform or to the at the email address to Rafał?
Which way is more convenient for you? Choose the one which is most convenient for you.
Okay, thank you. Give me just a moment, please.
Profesor nam udostępnił przed chwilą. Wystarczy otworzyć na swoim komputerze, udostępnić ekran. Przez chwilę była widać prezentacja.
Tak, tak, tylko że ja jeszcze mam tekst uzupełniający, którego wtedy nie widzę.
Aha, okej.
Dobrze. Małgosia, can I say the presentation to you, to your...
I have problems with net at the moment, and we are working on Rafał's computer, so it would be better to send it directly to ISRS or to Rafał's email.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Rafał, could you please give me your email address, because I have it.
Rafał Iwański.
Rafał?
Tak, Rafał Iwański @wp.pl.
Mhm. Okay. You should have it, Rafał. I'd be grateful if you could open it and show to the rest of participants, because I have some problems.
We are waiting still for getting it.
Okay, I'm going to start my presentation because the time is out. Solitude in existentialist writing. Maybe let's look at some introductory things. It's surprising that despite its legendary popularity, turning especially in the 40s and 50s of the 20th century as an intellectual fashion, to this day, existentialism has not lived in the world literature to see a critical study what would bring closer in a systematic way one of its most characteristic ideas. I mean, obviously, solitude. Notwithstanding the prominent, though formally non-primary place it occupies in existentialism, regardless of its provenance, whether confessional or non-confessional, few authors identified with this philosophy have explicitly undertaken an intentional reflection on solitude. These undoubtedly include quite apart from the well-known and ultimately unresolvable objections, controversies, and doubts about the qualification of these figures as representatives of existentialism and the difficulties of defining it. Let us note that the very concept of existence, central and crucial to this internally diverse current, also remains undefinable, as well as the differences between, let's say, French existentialism and the German philosophy of existence. Let's say that among the most distinguished existentialist writers and philosophers are Miguel de Unamuno, Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger, Nikolai Berdyaev, Paul Tillich, and Emmanuel Mounier. It is conceivable that due to the estimated small numbers of texts by existential philosophers explicitly devoted to solitude, the subject is virtually, practically non-existent in studies of existentialism. These works can be divided into those which directly or indirectly refer to the legacy of this current. The former are theoretical, the latter are empirical. Existential problems, problematic existence. It's the next part of my presentation. Existentialist philosophy is commonly associated with its flagship issues like freedom, authenticity or inauthenticity, finitude, ambivalence, contingency, and tragedy of human existence, passing imperceptibly into absurdity, triggering an inner rebellion, and in implacable fear, bordering on despair, a sense of disintegration and helplessness. It is puzzling that in this panorama of existentialist thought that has been presented, solitude does not appear, despite the fact that it is one of the most basic, common, and enduring determinants of human existence. Clark Mustakas, for example, confidently claims that solitude is a condition of human life, an experience of being human, which enables the individual to sustain, extend, and deepen his humanity. Man is ultimately and forever lonely, obviously due to Clark Mustakas, whether his solitude is the exquisite pain of the individual living in isolation or illness, the sense of absence caused by a loved one's death, or the piercing joy experience in triumphant creation. I believe, asks Clark Mustakas, I believe it is necessary for every person to recognize his solitude, to become intensely aware that ultimately in every fiber of his being, man is alone, terribly, utterly alone. Efforts to overcome or escape the existential experience of loneliness can result only in self-alienation. When man is removed from a fundamental truth of life, when he successfully evades and denies the terrible solitude of individual existence, he shuts himself off from one significant avenue of his own self-growth. Another solitude researcher, also last participant of our Symposium, Ben Lazary-Miuskowicz takes a similar view. In his numerous works, he has consistently, despite criticism, expressed his belief that all men are poignantly lonely, all men desperately seek to escape this condition. This is because loneliness is probably the most primary, universal, and necessary condition of being human. Generalizing this perspective, following George Kotkin, we can say that solitude, like any existential moment, is a universal phenomenon, common to all people, constituting a structural and inalienable component of the human condition, integrating individual experiences in the universal formula of the hermeneutics of human facticity. Consequently, there is really and ultimately practically no escape from this, let's say for Miuskowicz, so-called solipsistic prison of frightening solitude. The pictorial and evocative metaphor of being trapped in solitude is nothing peculiar or unprecedented. It is used, among others, in Polish specialist literature, for example, by Jacob Mombro, in relation to Samuel Beckett's image of the world. Ina Bergman identifies imprisonment explicitly as synonymous with solitude. George Minuit, citing the work of François Dolto, concludes that we are, like prisoners, locked in single cells, helpless, unable to help each other. It is not without reason that Amy Rockach links the issue directly to existentialism. After all, the motive of man's unalternative and irrevocable imprisonment in solitude constitutes one of the fundamental and most important in the existentialist agenda. Labyrinth of solitude. The inalienability of solitude with philosophical finesse, accuracy, and depth is also shown in Octavio Paz's excellent essay entitled The Dialectic of Solitude. It contains statements that would make the most dutiful existentialist philosophers of solitude from Sartre through Tillich to Berdyaev. For example, all men at some moment in their lives feel themselves to be alone, and they are. To live, it is to be separated from what we were in order to approach what we are going to be in the mysterious future. Solitude is the profoundest fact of the human condition. Man is nostalgia and a search for communion. We are condemned to live alone, but also to transcend our solitude. Solitude, the very condition of our lives, appears to us as a test and a purgation. Death and birth are solitary experiences. We are born alone and we die alone. And last point of my presentation is entitled The Concept of the Liminality of Solitude. As life shows and is confirmed by numerous testimonies, spoken and unspoken, publicized and hidden, most people, if not all, long for understanding, acceptance, tenderness, closeness, acceptance, reciprocity. This is undeniable proof of the reality of the radical solitude discovered by the existentialist writers, from which, in a Levinatian manner, we try to escape out of fear. It remains stubbornly radical, however, and in a twofold sense of the word source-wise, from the Latin word radix, which means root, beginning, source, basis, and dictionary-wise, combining radicality with totality and roughlessness. As I have tried to show in this presentation by referring to the heritage of existentialism taken from the illusory hope that it is possible to exhaust an essentially inexhaustible subject in such a short form, solitude is the root of every existence, its basis and source. This is where its inexorable roughlessness comes from. At this point, it is difficult to deny the right of the great researcher and popularizer of knowledge about solitude, about whom I have mentioned, Ben Miuskowicz, when he states that no philosophy, no literature, poetry, art, religion, psychology, medicine can promise of any permanent cure for this affliction, since if, indeed, man is essentially isolated, he can never, in principle, overcome this monadic condition. There can be no final escape from or transcendence beyond solitude so long as man is alive. Therefore, instead of fighting against it, one should rather, like the existentialists, redirect one's energy from unproductive escaping from it to the effort of understanding who the human being is as a monad, remembering in the background the warning that the source of the biggest and most frequent of our life problems, dilemmas, and despair is not solitude, but society. Consequently, instead of running away from solitude, it is better to resort to it, finding in it a safe haven from the risks and dangers that life brings every day to us. For this to ever happen, however, it is necessary to revise the dominant belief system and the resulting hierarchy of values in which solitude is perceived unambiguously and unquestionably as a significant threat. Maybe it is worthwhile in our understanding of solitude to follow the inspiring lead of John Barbour, who argues that solitude is liminal and as such is not oriented towards escaping the world, but to a different kind of participation within it. Perhaps it is high time that solitude began to be studied and treated as an anthropological constant. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for such interesting presentation showing us how deeply solitude is related to the topic of solitude is related to existential philosophy. And now we will move to the second presentation. Olivia Sagan, the problem with the problem of loneliness. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Can you guys see my screen, my slide?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I will begin then. So greetings to everybody from a very snowy Scotland this morning. Lovely to be here. And thank you for to my previous colleague for reminding me of the importance of running towards solitude, something that I have spent my life doing quite happily. So I like to have that reinforced. A very, very quick word of thanks, special thanks this morning to our Polish hosts. Poland is currently providing refuge for some of my Ukrainian family who managed to get out of the west of Ukraine just 2 weeks ago. So I'm particularly grateful to Poland for offering that refuge on their onward part of their onward journey to the UK. Thank you very much. There is a hand up already. Should I take that hand, or will the chair?
I see your screen, no presentation, but screen.
Oh, okay, right, okay. So that's thank you for letting me know that. Okay, I'm not sure why that's happening. Just bear with me. Okay. It may be that. Do you see the presentation now?
Yes. No, we can see that.
Do you see a slide now? You do.
Yes, this is good enough. Yeah, thanks.
You see the slide? Yeah, there is only one slide, so I will be reading from a paper. So I'll just start if that's okay with everybody. Okay, so in the paper on which this short talk is based, and the paper is ready for submission, so I'm just going to be extracting some points from the paper. In the paper, I give an overview of the literature of loneliness. So we all need to switch our minds from considerations of solitude and silence that our previous speakers have given to the problem of loneliness. And everyone in the room understands that that demands a completely different part of our brain in terms of cognition and emotion. So I'm going to be talking about the problem with the problem of loneliness. And in the paper, I give an overview of the literature of loneliness, which of course many of you are familiar with, and the additional aspects provided to this body of work by the COVID pandemic in particular. I also in the paper give an overview of the phenomenological and psychoanalytical perspectives, which also give a much more nuanced view on the question of loneliness, regarding it more as important in terms of our capacity to play, to create, and to edge towards self-fulfillment and authenticity. Also in the paper, I look at the richness of loneliness exploration within literature and philosophy more generally. So where I want to begin this talk is the point in the paper where I pick up on the politics of loneliness in terms of individualization and medicalization of loneliness, which I see as a core contemporary problem. Derived from oneliness, the word loneliness only picked up currency post-1800 as industrial society began to disperse us and capitalism began to fragment us and consumerism began to isolate us, leaving us, as we know from Putnam, to bowl alone, to live alone, to age alone, and to die alone, as pointed out by Nelson Becker. Headline statements, however, about the preponderance of being alone mask a more granular view of the phenomenon, as one, for example, of the costs of more choice. As Dunn in 2010 put it, there is an inherent paradox in the experience of liberal democracy, as loneliness is both a fulfillment and a disruption of its possibility. The rise of privacy, for example, itself is a product of market capitalism, but it's a driver of loneliness. While living in a remote or rural location has been indicated as a risk factor for social isolation and loneliness, according to Henning Smith and others, the pandemic triggered a further rise in what was already a drift of affluent urbanites to rural areas who cite a desire for privacy and space as part of their reasoning. We have more choice now too about who we live with, whether to remain in unhealthy relationships or not, whether to live in overcrowded settings or not, and whether to uproot and move in search of a better life. The trend of single-person households appears to extend across all world regions, according to Ortiz and Ospina. in Jameson and Simpson. Digital nomadacy, as a fast increasing employment choice, has loneliness already as a demonstrable challenge amongst its population, and the so-called gig economy has been shown to foster uber alienation and loneliness. Some such choices in our post-developed societies are evidently double-edged swords. Indeed, as pointed out by Gillies in 2003, many of the de-traditionalization gains made in the 20th century, most notably, according to Snell, for women, did come at a price, but one that we may still be willing to pay. Critical evaluations of the family, for example, as, quote, a stultifying and essentially oppressive institution, were to be welcomed as enabling more egalitarian alternatives to the family to develop. Choices always come at a cost, and this dilemma, faced by many who are extricating themselves from oppressive family, cultural, religious, or institutional structures, is one that is not helped by the current alarmist discourse of loneliness. It is time, therefore, that we look at what is omitted from the big headlines regarding loneliness. Implicated in the phenomenology of loneliness is a complex, bidirectional weave of experience, cognition, emotion, and both mental and physical health. And it's most accurately identified, as Alberti did in 2019, as an emotional cluster rather than discrete emotion. A growing body of research indicates that in this mix, socio-demographic and intersectional factors, according to Chipun Liu, social roles, quantity and quality of social contact, health, and dispositions all contribute to individual differences in feelings of loneliness. The links between social capital and loneliness are relatively underexplored, but some findings do suggest that low social capital, especially in terms of low trust, may be a risk factor for loneliness. Loneliness study, however, rarely captures this multidimensionality of it, how the subjective state changes over time, nor importantly, how our own resilience, resourcefulness, and creativity may be brought to manage and even exploit loneliness. Almost entirely overlooked in contemporary study is an alternative framing of loneliness, including its possible benefits. Evidence of the detrimental impacts of loneliness continues to be put forward, and these are the big attention-grabbing headlines. But we should note, according to Fried and others in 2020, large gaps remain in our understanding of loneliness, the rates and drivers of loneliness in different populations, and its effect on health being. We should be mindful too that there is also a danger, and this is important, there is a danger that fears of loneliness and the ubiquitous discourse of loneliness and its place in the popular international consciousness contribute to the very growth of the loneliness problem, performing medicalization through popularization. The ways in which loneliness is framed in popular and academic discourse invariably both individualize it and medicalize it, framing loneliness as a public health issue according to many sources, rather than a socio-economic problem, with few studies investigating the intersectional impact that socioeconomics and loneliness have on poor health. Lee Hunt and colleagues in 2017 also note that while literature linking loneliness and isolation to increasing health inequalities is growing, far fewer studies have investigated the risk factors due to socioeconomics. Loneliness is rarely approached as an issue exacerbated or even caused by particular policies in housing, welfare, and education that effectively isolate, separate, discriminate, and stigmatize people. Perceived overcrowding, for example, has been shown to drive feelings of disconnectedness, according to Rugal and others. Bereft of community, family, social structures such as libraries, community centres, swimming pools, populations are then targeted by interventions against loneliness, which routinely prescribe behaviours that they may well already have exhibited before the local bus service, for example, was reduced, or before the local community centre was closed under austerity regimes. Further, by medicalizing what should be positioned as a social problem and associating it de facto with health problems located in the individual, it could be argued that this in itself is detrimental to people's well-being through the potential iatrogenic effects and by removing a sense of personal and communal autonomy over people's health. Much revisited for contemporary considerations of loneliness by political scientists of the 21st century is the work of the philosopher Hannah Arendt. Arendt's deep take on loneliness in The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1973 suggests that we have entered a stage of organized loneliness, encouraged by government in order to increase the docility of citizens, with the birth of totalitarianism in the 20th century only being possible through the isolation of people. Through the use of isolation and terror, totalitarian regimes create the conditions for loneliness and then appeal to people's loneliness with ideological propaganda. Loneliness, Arendt argued, means that people lose contact with their thinking selves, and terror and panic replace solitary thought. In cutting us off from human connection, loneliness is, quote, amongst the most radical and desperate experiences of man, because in loneliness we are impotent, unable to realize our full capacity for collective action. This connection between loneliness and politics is gradually being exposed. Olivia Lang beautifully said in The Lonely City that loneliness is personal, it's also political. And the commentator, Georges Monbiot, notes that though our well-being is inextricably linked to the lives of others, we are bombarded with a message that our prosperity is based on competitive self-interest, individualism and consumption, messages of core use to liberal economics. Damon Linker in 21 suggests that the most ominous thing of all about rising rates of loneliness is that therein lies a partial explanation for increased political polarization, with increasing numbers of people attracted to more radical forms of political dissent on both the right and the left. He also suggests that if loneliness and isolation become worse, so could our political pathologies. All of which makes the 2016 murder of the MP in the UK, Jo Cox, even more tragic and yet potentially more galvanising. During her time as an MP, she formed an independent cross-party commission of MPs and charities to highlight the need to help lonely people in our community. It is a terrible irony that she died after being shot and stabbed multiple times by a supporter of white supremacism and exclusive nationalism, the very kind of populist, polarized non-thinking that Hannah Arendt warned was a consequence of citizens becoming isolated and vulnerable to political pathologies of the type Arendt and her contemporary commentators cite. As a broad category of economic principles, neoliberalism has been charged with being a key driver of distinct shifts in mental health policy, the force behind motivated shift from public collective values to private individualistic ones, and to the commodification of mental health. The Foucauldian docile body of Foucault in 1977 can be invoked. Inherently flawed, we are then provided consumables to fix the problem. In this Foucauldian schema, wherein we are made subjects, that is, made subject to, the mentally ill subject is subjected to a landscape of thinking where biopsychiatric truths are assumed across government, seeded with neoliberal discourse that urges self-management and reiterated and disseminated as common sense ideals. Such discourse employs a moralistic undertone to craft the person as both expert and manager of their own care. Within such reiterated sentiments of responsibilization, individuals are expected to take moral responsibility to be healthy, productive, committed, employable, and successful. The willful, unengaged, perhaps lonely individual is steered towards behavior change, diagnosis, biotechnical treatment. This process of responsibilizing citizens, however, also succeeds in irresponsibilizing governments and institutions. Neoliberalism's promotion of competition is widely claimed to be undermining a sense of solidarity and social security. A 2021 study argues that neoliberalism, quote, appears to be harmful to health because it can create a sense of being disconnected from others. Its market-centric logic continues to inform policy in a number of social democracies, but it's also being exported to the global south through economic austerity programs enforced, for example, by the World Bank and international monetary funds, who have been criticized by Brenner and others as agents of transnational neoliberalism. Part of a pattern of what Ritzer refers to as one of hyperconsumption, an increase in materialism is also associated with loneliness. In a 2013 study by Peters, materialism was associated with an increase in loneliness over time, and loneliness was associated with an increase in materialism over time. Tragically, in this bizarre logic, we buy stuff that makes us feel lonelier, so we buy more stuff, which suggests we should heed the words of Becker and colleagues who urge that we tackle loneliness and we need to be mindful of the fact that its causes can be political as much as social and psychological. I just want to now quickly turn to a few studies that I have carried out in 2017 and 2020 and 21, most recently amongst refugee populations, looking at the problem of loneliness. I have carried this out to support my argument that, one, we undermine the experience of enduring loneliness by the proliferation of headline myths about its general ubiquity and contribute to further testimonial injustice by which we do not accurately hear, acknowledge and address the pain of others. And I'll remind the audience that my work is carried out with people with long-term mental health difficulties. The second argument I wish to underpin is to show how loneliness is experienced as the result of particular socio-political moments, policy and decisions, rather than being located in and springing from individual deficit, flaw or inability. So my work with refugee populations at the moment clearly shows that socio-political moments and policy decisions are directly a cause of loneliness and isolation in that population. It's nothing to do with pathology or individual flaw. All the studies I cite demonstrated that, contrary to contemporary portrayals of human beings as vulnerable and defenseless in the face of increasing mental health problems, we are in fact astoundingly resilient and resourceful. My recent study amongst refugee populations, Strang and colleagues 2021, demonstrates that we are much more able to make connections, build appropriate community, and help other fellow human beings, given that our simple basic needs are met. They each suggest that characteristics of neoliberal society act precisely as Hannah Arendt warned. They unworld us. My research with people with enduring mental health difficulties has suggested time and again that the experience of loneliness in people with susceptibility to mental distress begins in childhood or adolescence, and a loneliness born of early deprivation, lack of validation, not being seen, and it's compounded by further experiences of illness and testimonial injustice, loss and deprivation. This enduring loneliness was spoken of by patients and participants across my studies in haunting terms, but couched within experiences of trauma, violence, loss, deprivation, dissociation. So in the paper, I give lots of quotes from the participants, but I'm going to draw to a close now because I'm aware of time. Let me just summarize the arguments that I put forward in the paper and that I have begun to share with you guys today. Number one, current headlines and many of the studies that we ourselves in the social scientific community proliferate, these undermine the lived experience of chronic loneliness and contribute to further epistemic injustice by normalizing loneliness. Secondly, loneliness constructed along neoliberal lines through policy in housing, transport, education, welfare and healthcare has a pernicious effect with political ramifications as described by Arendt. Finally, we may not be all as lonely as we have been made to think we are, and it's high time that we applied more agentic thinking to the situation. So let's turn down the volume, on the loneliness headlines, as we are also remarkably resilient and resourceful in the face of an alienating, fragmenting neoliberal regime. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I already have some questions, but we wait for the discussion at the end. And now let us introduce the first speaker, Henrietta Servan, with the topic Solitude as Subjective Horizons. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers, to the patrons and sponsors of this symposium, if there are some. But even more, thank you, all of you, for being here, because you make everything possible. Your interest, your ideas, your research is giving the flesh of this common project. I'm going to share my presentation. Can you see it?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay. So my theme is solitude as subjective horizon, and it is part of my my insight that contemporary philosophy experiences a subjective turn nowadays, and also is part of a work in progress, a larger project of philosophy of pedagogy in a more contemporary tone, speculating this concept of horizon as both a limit, threshold, and an opportunity or opening. So I have this idea to interpret solitude as an opportunity for subjectivity. It is an opportunity to cultivate someone's own subjectivity. This is the idea of working with oneself, coping with oneself in a more complex and fulfilling manner in solitude. And I've selected for beginning two quotes that are really suggestive and full of meaning. First is the idea of Rainer Maria Rilke, I am alone in this world and yet not alone enough. And the other one is Emile Cioran's perspective that loneliness does not teach you that you are alone, but that you are the only one. Both of them are surprising, but the second one, it's really startling. How should we understand it? Not only that there are not many people left to see existence in these terms, but most people, in my view, would react to these ideas that they are either incomprehensive or meaningless or annoying, as an expression of arrogance or even madness. They may seem about arrogance, but they are all about reflection. The second quote, especially in my view, is not about arrogance, but about this triad: solitude, reflection, responsibility. In terms that you are the only one to understand yourself, you are the only one to help yourself, you are the one to improve yourself, you're the closest being to yourself. You are the one to ask things for yourself, to change and endure, to decide when to change, what to endure, etc. The road to oneself and authenticity, and here underlying is the philosophy of Heidegger, goes deeply into aloneness, into the symbolic inquiry and into paradoxical struggles. In my view, contemplative subjectivity is nourishing solitude, and it's somewhat a luxury in nowadays society. But still, after 2 years of pandemics and weeks of war at the doors of the EU, our society is so competitive and so superficial, and it's so estranging to people. Solidarity and generous causes are pretty much adjacent of what is fashionable on the public agenda, immersed in a Western society characterized by Manichaeist visions of the world, by a culture of conformism, aversion to dissent on the one hand, and a culture of outrage, stigma, and blame, as well as intransigence to different on the other hand. While good causes are still good causes, they are proof that we are among the good ones and part of the good teams, and our rejection and hatred of others is righteous and fully justified. And often that's the case. There's no room for interpretation. Another useful concept in constructing this idea of solitude that can be an occasion to nourish someone's subjectivity, I want to discuss the concept of hug box, the concept of a safe place, of a good place that has such an important role in our everyday engagement with social activities and social networks and internet activities, and with a certain psychology that is derived from this culture of outrage and conformism. A hug box is intuitively something soothing, something comforting, something warm that we all need in our lives, and something that we search for, a horizon of freedom, escaping from everyday tensions and anxieties. Urban language took the concept of a hug machine, also known as a hug box, a squeeze machine, an embracing device, to express this safe place people find and create among agreeable contacts, especially on social media, but not only, to soothe their hypersensitivity to dissent. I have here on the lower right part of my slide, I have even an expression of the way Hugbox got speculated by the economic purposes and economic incentives or initiatives. And this is a gift hug box full of sweets and nice things that will comfort and bring you joy. Our solitude could be a hug box, but also in a paradoxical way of seeing things, any hug box could be a trap. Is a hug box a safeguard? Which is the safeguard against experience our own hug box as a trap? The safeguard is just our value matrix. That's no way around it. Our matrix of values is our hierarchy and our interconnection of important things that orient our lives and our actions and attitudes in ethical and pragmatic terms. We all have our own philosophy, either we are aware of it or not. And this hierarchy of values is present there, consciously or not, in all the choices that we make. We live in this world of digitalization, transformation, development, and aim, but digitalization is the foundation of the world of great numbers. A world where distinct individuals, diversity, and their alterity is something to be rather corrected and something difficult to process. I find this culture of conformism to be of great importance, and I'm trying to underline here main meanings that will clarify my point. We are immersed in a culture of conformism, but we can't go beyond that. People obviously enjoy the spiritual and emotional blessings of belonging. This is in philosophical and sociological terms as well as the benefits of belonging. Belonging is not exactly conformism, but conformism mimics belonging. In our culture of conformism, the next best thing to belonging is acceptance, compliance, docility, obedience, subordination. In a way, hello Hegel. However, one belongs first to oneself. How do you cope with oneself? Alone, one hears, sees, feels, listens, experiences more, louder, better, if the case. This could be overwhelming. This could be refreshing on the other hand. This would be welcome, or it could be stressful, a source of pain and painful rehearsal of negativity, of anxious states and feelings, of failures, of envy, of resentment, or in my methodological paradoxical view that I'm working out here, it could be an opportunity for being grateful, for being happy with yourself, of being in charge with your own life, etc., etc. I'm using Edmund Husserl and his idea of intentional horizon. That is a general structure of experience. This is how Husserl sees it. What happens in solitude, the contemplative awareness toward the self and the world, is very important, and it's based on that matrix of values that is either learned via socialization and schooling, or self-educated and self-imposed in someone's life. So the main character in our story here is the contemplative being. The contemplative being envisions the potential developments of self according to a general structure of personal intentionality, according to principles and cognitive affordances. The contemplative being projects actual or potential future experiences, the things that can be anticipated, and they constitute what Husserl calls intentional horizon of the indexical experience. The richness, the moral generous content, and the hopefulness of this future experience that we envision in silence are dependent on the personal character. They are dependent on cognitive, emotional, and principled affordances. I liked this term. It's in quotation marks not only because it seems a bit forced and it seems it's not used in the direct meaning here, but it's used by another researcher that I'm quoting in the selective bibliography, so it's not my finding. In fact, all the actual or potential experiences constituting that horizon, the intentional horizon, share a sense of identity through time. In our interpretation, they also shape and orient the sense of identity and the future presupposition, attitudes, aims, projects, actions. Principles and values have their awakening this way in scene, a noematic scene of dynamic interconnection, influx, and not a mind composed of static moments of consciousness. In this sense, the contemplative being in solitude is checking, restoring, or reforming subjectiveness. Experienced experience inherently assumes or assumed values. We experience things, but at the same time we interpret what we experience. This is the way that we make that experience ourselves. So that's why I'm forcing here or an expression that seems just a redundancy, but it's much more than that. Experience, it's always experienced experience. Another philosopher that I capitalize upon and uses the idea, the concept of horizon is Lucian Blaga, Romanian philosopher, contemporary one. In his philosophy, which is very complex and I cannot summarize here, man is a special being who lives in the horizon of mystery. So man is a reflective being, one that is constantly curious and constantly creative. Is a reflective being that sends flamed arrows into the metaphysical darkness. That's a very beautiful expression that gives you an idea about what it's like to be situated and to live in a horizon of mystery. Lucian Blaga does not talk about solitude, but we can easily understand that this living in the horizon of mystery has to impose or to presuppose a very good relation to solitude, a very creative relation to solitude, a relation that capitalizes in terms of meaning and creativity solitude. For Blaga, man is an ontological cosmic mutation, unique in the universe. Mystery is the fabric out of which man makes human history, makes his creations, and all different forms of knowledge I'm not going to talk about here that man has access to or forces even access to. In our interpretation, starting from Blaga, solitude is the perfect state of fulfilled subjectivity. For a reflective subjectivity in nascent creative state. And I'm giving here a very beautiful quote that gives you the full understanding of a creative state. Philosophical thinking, through its buildings and debris, through its delusions and disappointments that it does provoke to us all, through the suspicions and presentiments that it communicates to us, through the ever deeper inquiries that it occasions and invites, will mean therefore for the human genre an unlimited surplus of lucidity, its different stages being equivalent to as many awakenings from the infinite sleep where our being floats.
I'm so sorry, Henrietta. We're getting short of time now because we have 2 more presentations in the next half hour.
So my time is up.
It is pretty much. I loved your last quotation.
It's my last slide, and I'll just go to the conclusion directly.
Okay, thank you.
So in my discussion of relation between solitude and a sense of responsibility and subjective fulfillment, the matrix of values that a person is equipped with is very important. Self-analysis, self-understanding, self-motivation, self-incentive, and self-love are all very important. Empathy and love begin at home with loving values and aims for oneself. Solitude and its contemplative subjectivity open the being to oneself as to others in a more creative, generous, and principled way. And this is, I hope I have here. No, I don't. But whoever is interested in the research around the cognitive affordances, I'm going to make it available to you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your questions later on.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We hope to discuss it a little bit later. And now we are welcoming our fourth speaker, tour guide Piotr, with presentation A Silent Trace, introducing Wolfgang Schriedmacher's philosophy of the future. So let us start. Piotr, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit different than the format that has become the commonplace here. But okay, so this is going to be a lot about Martin Heidegger, who is a very famous philosopher, but it's of course obvious that many people here are not specialist philosophers. So let me just preface the paper with this short note. Yeah, Martin Heidegger, he was a German philosopher who became famous for his book Being and Time, and that was published in 1927. Then what happened was that he joined the National Socialist Party in Germany, and then when they took power in 1933, he was made rector of Freiburg, so he became Hitler's rector. Yeah. In 1945, Heidegger was removed from his post after the Allies had won the war and interrogated, and during this time he tried to put an end to his own life. Yeah. He was never fully rehabilitated during his lifetime, but he was able to lecture. He was a very popular lecturer, traveled widely on the lecture circuit until his death in 1976. Importantly, he never denounced his party membership. And to this day, he is regarded as one of the most, if not the most important philosophers of the 20th century. Yeah. So this is the paper. It is about what do we do with Heidegger today. Yeah. Often at conferences and among the hoi polloi of the literati, we hear jokes about Martin Heidegger's double standards. He condemned modern technology in the most damning of terms, and yet we see photographs of him hauling water from and we see photographs of him hauling water from a traditional well at his hut in the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest in Germany. And I'm gonna, if technology serves us now, I'm gonna show you a picture of him. Here he is. Can you see that he's hauling water here with a bucket, and you know, he's living out in the forest now. Yeah. These pictures were taken in 1966 in conjunction with an interview for Der Spiegel, but in agreement with him, it was not published until 1 week after he died, yeah, in 1976. So what happens here is that these pictures, they were taken with what was at that time a hyper-modern single-lens reflex camera. So they were designed to situate Heidegger cleverly as the chief maestro of philosophy of his time. So what we find in this picture is a visual representation of this profound metamorphosis that had occurred to him as a public figure since 1945. From the incarcerated and suicidal follower of Hitler, outcast and left to rot on the philosophical dump of history, Heidegger had reinvented himself. No longer was his chief concern man's unwillingness to come to terms with the nothingness, the void of being. The prescribed cure for which he had written in Being in Time was to take up an attitude of anticipatory resoluteness, so to be ready to fight in confrontation with the world. Rather, the danger intrinsic to our condition, he wrote later, was increasingly associated with modern technology. Heidegger perceived the technological inframing of our lives as the defining feature of our time, and the cause of everything from inauthentic existence to a potential nuclear wasteland. The image of Heidegger hauling water was thus the end point of his transformation from the existentialist favorite of the National Socialists in Germany to the pet philosopher of the emerging ecological movement, which he's very important there today. And as we see, this metamorphosis was crowned with this expression that can be characterized as nothing but a feat of public relations, accomplished with the most modern of technological procedures and apparatuses. So it is easy to snigger about this. Here is a man who, while condemning the implements of modern technology, reaches out and makes use of the same machineries to make a case for himself. To Heidegger, there was no doubt that our modern time was distinctly different from the classical period, and not in a good way. While the ancients also made use of technologies to make pots, jewelry, or to write, it is only in our epoch that technology has become the dominant frame for our existence. This inframing, what Heidegger called Gestell, renders everything as a resource, so reducing all things, people, animals, physical and metaphysical items, to objects that can be exploited, manipulated, and put to use. This is Heidegger's main point in his later philosophy, right? So Heidegger's critique, while alluring, has an obvious problem. Portraying our contemporary age as a degenerate victim of modern technology would in effect reduce the crimes of the political organization of which he was a member, the NSDAP in Germany, to a series of unavoidable, albeit tragic events for which no single person should be blamed. The terror machine unleashed in the 1930s, the argument goes, was all due to our cruel and decadent times. In essence, it was technology that was to blame. And nevertheless, when we fully acknowledge the multiple crises that beset us today, it isn't difficult to acknowledge that Heidegger did have a point. Is it not our technological inventiveness that has enabled us to exploit the planet to such an extent that we are on the verge of eradicating our own species through biological destruction, climate change, and the effects of global warming? Is it not the insanely efficient weapons that we ourselves have made that threaten to eliminate all remnant of life on this our only home? And with a cruel twist to this story, when the techno-utopians such as Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk hold that no, such annihilation is not really a problem, since we can just build a spaceship and fly off to populate a new world, how can we not suspect that this new world would be beset by precisely the same shortcomings as our own, since we have not properly dealt with this dilemma at the heart of our civilization? So here again we return to Heidegger with his hewing of water at the well in Schwarzwald. From the photo, we can surmise that the solution he proposes to our present crisis is that we return to the ancient way, that we draw water from wells, make fire from sticks, renounce the modern state, healthcare and childcare, as well as mass organizations and mass culture. Well, all right, some of these inventions won't be much missed, but should we take the proposition of returning to the pre-modern age seriously, or should we regard it more as a public relations effort from the aging patriarch of European philosophy? The simplest solution here, of course, would be for us to acknowledge that Heidegger, like all of us, was a mortal, inclusive of the wrinkles and faults that all mortals have, and that we therefore, even as we recognize his power as philosopher, realize that he was not by any means immaculately raised above human mortality and capacity for mistakes and errors. This, the simplest solution, has nevertheless not been the one grasped in our contemporary debate on Heidegger's legacy. Rather, with the publication of Heidegger's Black Notebooks in 2014, the chair of the German Heidegger Society resigned from his post, as he was now able, he said, to read for himself the extent to which anti-Semitism had clouded Heidegger's thinking in the mid-1930s. It is not difficult to understand the impulse of throwing Heidegger's texts onto the fire when we learn for the first time of the philosopher's vile passion directed against minorities and foreigners. However, this trend in Heidegger scholarship has been around for decades. And the problem with the proposition that in order for us to read a philosopher's texts, and in order for us to learn anything from them, we must also condone his values and act, is that we must then equally consign to the flames the works of a slaveholder, such as Plato, a misogynist of Schopenhauer's caliber, and indeed an anti-Semite, as Heidegger often was, particularly in the 1930s. Okay, so now, whether or not Jacques Lacan the French psychoanalyst who saw himself as the chief successor of Sigmund Freud in France, was aware of Heidegger's more unsavory attitudes is not known, but he is likely to have been well aware of Heidegger's NSDAP membership. People knew at that time he was a Nazi. In spite of this, Lacan found in Heidegger's philosophy the seed of his own theory of the subject, an absolutely essential addition to psychoanalysis after Freud. When we talk today about the split, or in Lacan's terms, the barred subject, this is a sense of a subject that is to a crucial extent shut out from itself. Yeah? And this notion of subjectivity emerges directly from Heidegger's idea of the existent, as Heidegger called it in a famous essay called Letter on Humanism. So in other words, if we are to cleanse psychoanalysis of everything that can be referred back to Heidegger, we would have to undo this most essential notion in Lacan. And a similar stance to that of Lacan is what we find in the work of Wolfgang Schirmacher. And you could say that European Graduate School, which Schirmacher founded, a very important private university in Switzerland, is founded on this very attitude to Heidegger. So while Schirmacher acknowledges that Heidegger's view on technology can lead down a hopelessly reactionary path and to a rejection of all invention and social change, there is nevertheless an unmistakable corrective point to be taken from the claim that buried in the heart of progress is a dark and destructive impulse. For this reason, and against the techno-utopians, it should be clear that that technological and social progress in itself will not save us from the human-made disasters, the catastrophes that we have brought upon ourselves. We can't just build a spaceship and fly away from them. Something else and more is required, and Schirmacher's way to demonstrate this non-necessary character of technology is to change the non-necessary character of technology. Relation between technology and change is non-necessary. And the way he does that is to redefine its most essential characteristic from the temporal and epochal. Heidegger referred to this as the technological epoch, to the evental. So it has to do with the event. Okay, so now as was the case with, hang on, let's see, are we still on, right. So again, as was the case with the subject we have discussed earlier, this sense of the event is derived from Heidegger and his notion of Ereignis. Yeah? So the point for Schirmacher is to approach technology in a way that radically differs from the one we associate with technological utopianism, a view that perceives technologies as crafts and as means to an end. So against this utilitarian or instrumental approach to technology, Schirmacher takes the essential part of technology to be its non-willed character. The event in this sense, the Ereignis, is something more like a happening than a contest. It stands for something that can take place without our willing and without our comprehension, like the rustling of leaves as a gust of wind tickles a tree, the way the sun illuminates a clearing in the forest, or as Friedrich Hölderlin put it in Heidegger's favorite poem, Homecoming, the exuberant display we get when the sparkling snow is full of roses. It is in this sense a happening, an experience, an involuntary act of breathing, that we should grasp the event in the relevant sense. So what does this sense of event mean for subjectivity? To Heidegger, existence was a term that was mustered in distinction to a subjectivity marked by intentionality. In one well-known explication of the term, he emphasized the essentially caring character of the subject, and then goes on to say that our being occurs essentially as thrown. It unfolds essentially in the throw of being as the fateful sending. Okay, so this is, some people call it Heideggerian poetry, but let's just unpack it a little bit, yeah? What we have here is this radical emphasis on those things we cannot control. We are thrown into the world without any sense of intention or purpose prior to the event, and the unfolding of our lives is marked not by our own intentionality, but by a fate that is sent to us, that is our destiny. It is this man outside himself that became the famous de-centered subject of psychoanalysis after Lacan. And again, this evental or hermeneutic shift in subjectivity has a clear trace we will now see at the end in Schirmacher's philosophy. So what we have is Schirmacher's homo generator, what he himself has called his most central concept. This is a new man of philosophy. It is a creature that enjoys life without knowing why, and who acts without believing in the principles behind our actions. In other words, what we have is a subject that is essentially detached from intentionality. Okay, so the sun is coming home, so we will see if we can complete this. The subject is detached from intentionality, and the subject's acts and beliefs are at a radical disjunction. We act, we believe, but they don't necessarily hang together. We have seen how Schirmacher took us beyond the epochal perspective of a technological age, a time marked by Gestell or technological enframing, to a view of technology as event, with the notion of technology that includes our techniques of breathing, eating, perceiving, and so on. All these are technologies for Schirmacher. And here again, Schirmacher moves us beyond what we may somewhat ungenerously call Heidegger's romanticism. Yeah? While Heidegger found our most significant moments to be those when we experience being outside ourselves, our ecstatic divinations, if you wish, Schirmacher's homo generator provides us with a way to live precisely when we do not have such profound experiences in our everyday lives, right? So in this way, Schirmacher complements Heidegger's formula for the good life. If Heidegger's was built as a critique against an ethics based on utilitarianism, positivism, and intentionality, finding instead the purposelessness, the revelatory, the involuntary as beacons of knowledge, Schirmacher provides a supplementary point that we cannot remain at this kind of peak of insight, this revelatory moment, right? So homo generator provides us with this formula to operate, this is a quote, invisible to our sensor and beyond good and evil, thus putting on in this what we can call this sacred zone of ineffable experiences, while also furnishing us with the tools to preserve what he calls our human sanity. So, homo generator then, he enables us to make full use of our arts of perception, but also protects the hyper-perceiver, these who are present in this ineffable moment, from what Lacan would have called psychotic immersion. This protective device is the ethical core of Schirmacher's philosophy. This is not the type of ethics that prohibits the subject from entering into novel relations. Schirmacher explicitly declares the purpose of homo generator to be to undermine the censoring instance of the superego, but instead it serves as a provider of this crucial anchoring point for the traveler. So to finish off here, consider this image from Schirmacher. In our postmodern mediated world of instant personalities, talk shows and chat rooms provides media for group therapies that let even the weirdest of people feel like everyone else. This is you under different circumstances. Nevertheless, when we are fully immersed in the full-blown senselessness of contemporary media, it is our undisturbed life technique that generates our sanity. Our ethical life world continues its operation even when we are occupied elsewhere. And here it is in this sense that Schirmacher's ethics can be called clandestine. Our ethical belonging maintains our sanity even when we look away from it, operating underground while we pursue our mediated pleasures. So it would seem then that nothing could be more verbose and noisy.
I'm sorry to argue. We really are pushed for time.
Yeah.
You've run over. It's fabulous what you're saying, right. But I really need to stop you now. I'm sorry, Kate. I know you were trying to be fair to our next speaker.
Thank you very much. We move to Jaromir Brejdak and his presentation, The Social Ontology or the Ontology of a Lonely Individual, the Crucial Role of Empathy, a Philosophical Approach. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference. As a great honor to speak to the expert of loneliness and silence. Sorry, I'm not an expert, but I do my best to see at this problems from the perspective of phenomenology or anthropology, mainly focus on Max Scheler philosophy. And I ask for some patience. I try to find my paper. If not, I will ask Rafał to support me. I sent already my presentation, but
okay, I present your presentation. One moment.
Can you see a presentation at my screen now? Not the case.
I present your your presentation.
It will be great. It will be great. So the social ontology, or the ontology of a lonely individual, the crucial role of empathy, a philosophical approach, is the title of this presentation. And my arguments is that the loneliness is already implemented in our heads. It means in our perception, kind of feeling, in our epistemological individualism. And then I will show you two approaches to overcome this individualism, mainly based on two concepts. The first one is the evolutionary psychology of Michael Tomasello, and the second one is the phenomenology or act phenomenology or emotion phenomenology of Max Scheler. So from my perspective, loneliness will appear at this stage as a flaw or imperfection of our cognitive apparatus, focused on the visual side of reality. Therefore, please go further. And we have here the first step. We can focus on the social ontology in analytical approach, and three names are important here, as John Searle, Michael Bratman, and Margaret Gilbert. And if you know, the great achievement of John Searle was to find out additional kind of intentionality, so-called collective intentionality. But on the other hand, his weakness of his theory was he thought even a brain in a vat could realize the social acts. The correction came from Michael Bratman. Michael Bratman highlighted that brain in the vat is not enough to be a social being. So Therefore, we have to focus on relation. Relation is the key word for him. The third approach is coming from Margaret Gilbert, very interesting one. Gilbert highlighted that we need something more than brain in a vat, something more than relation. We need our commitments to be to build a community or to act as a single body. Single body was the expression of her. Therefore, I think we can make a big jump now. Yes, please go to the summary of this philosophical approach. Yes, thank you. So therefore, from the epistemological perspective, loneliness takes roots already in our heads and shows how we tend to see the world as a sum of isolated things, parts that we can hardly combine into the whole. Other ways to describe the community and further social world. Rafał, please make a step further. Yes, as already mentioned, we have this one back, please. As already mentioned, the evolutionary psychology of Michael Tomasello offer us new kind of view of our intentionality of our human beings, discovering a crucial role of empathy. In his natural history of human thinking, Tomasello shows some pillars of the emergent social reality and community based on shared feelings, so-called proto-conversation, shared intentionality, collective intentionality, and imitation. It's very interesting discovery. I think this proto-conversation is here considered as automatic and pre-reflexive diffusion and interpenetration of emotional states, especially pronounced between persons directing their streams of attention. These are social interaction in which the adult and the infant look, touch, smile, and vocalize toward each other in turn. But as most observers of infants have noted, the glue that holds proto-conversation together is not just contingency, but the exchange of emotion. Thank you. A step further. Yes, and interesting quotation which summarized this approach coming from Galang Zahavi. So, before we are in a position to theorize, simulate, explain, or predict mental status in others, we are already interacting with them and we understanding them in terms of their expressions, gestures, intention, and emotion, and in how they act toward us and others. Importantly, primary intersubjectivity is not primary simply in the developmental terms. Rather, it remains primary throughout the lifespan, across all face-to-face intersubjective expressions. And it underpins those developmentally later practices that may involve explaining and predicting mental status in other. So the emotional and pre-reflective core of we intentionality leads to higher forms of sociality and culture. But the base of this is this proto-conversation or primary intersubjectivity considered as a diffusion or inter-reaction flow of emotion, and it is something which gives us the opportunities to build more complex structure of our consciousness, especially shared intentionality or collective intentionality. Raphael, please go further. Yeah, what first? Oh, sorry. What first? There was a question beginning with what first. Okay, okay, it's this is done already. Oh, thank you. If we want to summarize this approach of Tomasello, two things are very important to notice. The first one is the crucial role of empathy, which bind us to a collective structure, I will say. And the second important issue is collaboration. Collaboration allow us as a human being made a big jump in our evolution. So not competition like Darwin proposed, but collaboration is the condition of the huge jump the human being made in their evolution. Okay, we go further, please. Many kinds of empathy was discovered and described by Tomasello. I will skip it. It's not so important. Yeah, we go further, please. Yeah. The third perspective is the perspective of phenomenology. In the early 20th century, we have several thinkers like Gerda Walter, Max Scheler, Edmund Husserl already cited, and Dietrich von Hildebrand, also Edith Stein. The philosopher working on the phenomenon of collective intentionality, on the phenomenon of different kind of collectivity. I pick one of them, Max Scheler. Raphael, please. And